Someone was leaving love letters on my desk at work. At first, I thought it was flattering. They noticed small things about me, things most people wouldn't catch. The way I held my coffee, the way I laughed. But then the letters started describing things no one should have known. A private phone call I made after hours, when I thought the entire floor was empty. A conversation I had inside my own apartment, on my own phone, 6 miles from the office. I went to security. I pulled the badge records, and one name kept showing up every single morning, an hour before anyone else arrived. But that's not the part that keeps me up at night. The part that keeps me up at night is what I found hidden in the back of my bedroom closet: a folded blanket that wasn't mine, a water bottle, granola bars, and a notebook filled with 40 entries describing what I looked like while I was sleeping. Someone hadn't just been watching me at work. Someone had been living inside my apartment, behind my closet door, watching me through the slats for months. And I never knew. I've been sitting with this for almost a year now, trying to figure out the right way to talk about it. Not because I'm afraid it'll happen again. I know it won't. But because for a long time, I couldn't separate what actually happened from the version of it I wanted to believe, the version where I was just unlucky, where I couldn't have seen it coming. The truth is harder than that. The truth is that I did see it coming, in dozens of small moments I chose to explain away, and by the time I finally stopped explaining, I was standing in a locked office at 11 o'clock at night, reading my own words quoted back to me in someone else's handwriting. But I should start where it actually began. In the spring of 2 years ago, I was 7 months into a new job at a mid-sized insurance brokerage in Columbus, Ohio. The company occupied the top 2 floors of a 5-story building near the Scioto River, one of those glass and brick renovations that used to be a warehouse. I worked in claims processing on the 4th floor, which was mostly open-plan cubicles with a few enclosed offices along the north wall for senior adjusters and management. The 5th floor was underwriting and executive. There was a shared break room on 4, a small kitchen on 5, and a basement level with storage, the mail room, and the building's mechanical systems. About 60 people worked in the building on any given day. I liked the job fine. It was stable. I'd moved to Columbus after a difficult breakup that had also cost me most of my friend group back in Pittsburgh, so I was starting over in a pretty literal sense. New city, new apartment, new routines. I didn't mind the loneliness as much as I thought I would. There was something almost clean about it. I went to work. I came home. I cooked simple meals. I read before bed. I was not happy, exactly, but I was steady. And after the chaos of the previous year, steady felt like enough. The first letter appeared on a Tuesday morning in late March. I found it on my desk when I arrived at 8:15. It was a plain white envelope, unsealed, with no name on the outside. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, the kind you'd buy at a nice paper goods store, heavy stock with a subtle linen texture. The handwriting was neat and unhurried, slightly slanted to the right, written in dark blue ink. It said, "I notice you every morning. The way you hold your coffee with both hands. The way you read the subject line of every email before you open any of them. I wonder if you know how rare it is, someone who still pays that kind of attention." That was it. No signature, no initial, no closing. Just those 3 sentences. My first reaction was mild amusement. My second was mild discomfort. My third, which settled in over the course of the morning, was something more like flattery. I know how that sounds. I was 31 years old, recently out of a relationship that had ended with me being told I was emotionally unavailable, living alone in a city where I knew almost no one. Someone noticing me, even anonymously, even strangely, filled a gap I hadn't realized was so wide. I didn't tell anyone about it. I put the letter in my messenger bag and took it home. The second letter came 4 days later, on Saturday. Except I don't work Saturdays. I found it Monday morning, again on my desk, again in a plain white envelope. This time the stationery was the same cream linen, the same blue ink, but the letter was longer. It described the shirt I'd worn the previous Wednesday, a dark green flannel I liked because it was soft and didn't wrinkle. It described the way I'd laughed at something my coworker Derek had said in the break room, and it said my laugh sounded different from everyone else's, like I was surprised each time that something was funny. You laugh like someone who forgot they were allowed to, it said. That line stayed with me. It stayed because it was accurate in a way that made my chest tight. I had been carrying myself through those months like someone on probation, careful and measured, and yes, when I laughed, it did catch me off guard. Whoever was writing these letters wasn't just watching me, they were reading me. I should have been alarmed. I want to be clear that I understand that now. But the letters were gentle, and they were perceptive, and I was lonely in a way that made gentleness feel like water in a dry month. So instead of alarmed, I was curious. I started looking around the office differently. I studied faces during meetings, watched who glanced my way in the break room, paid attention to who arrived early enough to leave something on my desk before I got there. The third letter came the following Tuesday. Same envelope, same stationery. It said, "I left early this morning to put this here before you arrived. The office is different when it's empty. Your desk is the neatest one on the floor. I sat in your chair for a moment. I hope that's not strange to say. I just wanted to see the room the way you see it." That one unsettled me more than the others. Not because of the content exactly, but because of the image it put in my head. Someone arriving in the dark, walking through the empty cubicle rows, pulling out my chair, sitting in it, looking at my monitor, my family photos, my little desk plant, breathing in the quiet space where I spent most of my waking hours. It felt intimate in a way that crossed a line I couldn't quite name, but I still didn't report it. Over the next 3 weeks, the letters came regularly, every 3 or 4 days, always on my desk in the morning, always the same materials. The handwriting never wavered in quality, which made me think the writer was drafting them carefully, maybe even copying them from a rougher version. The content stayed personal, but never explicit, never threatening. They described small things about me with an attentiveness that was, honestly, better than anything I'd experienced in my actual relationships. The way I tapped my pen against my lower lip when I was concentrating. The way I always held the door for the person behind me, even if they were far enough away that it created an awkward half-jog. The fact that I kept a novel in my bottom desk drawer and read a page or two when I thought no one was looking. That last detail is what first genuinely frightened me. My bottom desk drawer faces a narrow aisle between my cubicle and the wall. There's no line of sight to it from any other workstation. You would have to be standing directly behind me, close enough to read over my shoulder, or to know that drawer contained a book at all, let alone that I opened it during the day. I started taking inventory of my surroundings more carefully. I checked for angles, reflections, mirrors, anything that could give someone a vantage point. There was nothing. The only way to see into that drawer was to be physically present in my cubicle space, within about 3 feet of me. I mentioned the letters to Derek, casually, framing it as a funny office mystery. He thought it was a secret admirer situation and told me to enjoy it. I mentioned it to my cubicle neighbor, Priya, who thought it was sweet but said she'd be a little creeped out by the sitting in your chair part. I agreed with her more than I let on. Then the 7th letter changed things. It arrived on a Thursday, same as always, but this one referenced a phone call I'd made the evening before, not a work call. A personal call to my mother, which I'd made from my desk at about 5:45, after most of the floor had cleared out. I'd stayed late to finish a report and called her while the system was running a batch process. We talked for maybe 15 minutes. I told her about a recipe I'd tried that weekend, a chicken and rice dish that hadn't turned out well. I told her I'd burned the garlic. The letter referenced the burned garlic. It said, "I'm sorry about the garlic. Next time try adding it after the onions are already translucent. Lower heat. It makes a difference." I read that line 4 times. Then I put the letter down and looked around the floor. It was 8:20 in the morning. People were arriving, settling in, starting their computers. Everything was normal. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked. And I realized that the feeling crawling up my spine wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was fear. Real, physiological fear. My hands were cold, and my mouth was dry, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. Someone had been in the building on my floor, close enough to hear my personal phone conversation at a time when I believed I was alone. Not just in the building, close. Within earshot of a phone call I'd made at normal speaking volume. I went to the building's security office that afternoon. It was a small room near the lobby, staffed by a guard named Tom, who was friendly and competent. I explained the situation, keeping my tone calm and factual. Letters on my desk, personal details, the phone call reference. Tom took it seriously. He pulled up the camera feeds for the 4th floor. Here's the thing about our building's security system. There were cameras in the stairwells, the lobby, the elevator bank on each floor, and the parking garage. There were no cameras inside the actual office spaces. Company policy, something about employee privacy and monitoring laws. So Tom could show me who entered and exited the building and each floor, but not what they did once they were in the workspace. He pulled the footage from Wednesday evening. The log showed that after 5:30, 3 people had badge swiped onto the 4th floor. Me at 5:18, which was when I'd come back from a coffee run. Derek at 5:22, who I remembered seeing briefly before he left. And a 3rd swipe at 5:39, badge number assigned to a woman named Helen Marsh, who worked in document processing at the far end of the floor. I knew Helen, but only in passing. She was in her mid-40s, quiet, had been with the company for over a decade. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the break room a handful of times. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and kept a collection of small ceramic animals on her desk. I had never had a meaningful conversation with her. Tom noted that Helen's badge showed her leaving the floor at 6:12, roughly 10 minutes after my phone call would have ended. My badge showed me leaving at 6:21. We had been on the same floor, in the same open workspace, for over 30 minutes, during a period when I thought I was completely alone. I asked Tom to pull the footage from the mornings when the letters had appeared. He did. In every single case, the Helen Marsh had badge swiped onto the 4th floor between 6:45 and 7, a full hour or more before the general staff arrived. In every case, she left the floor briefly and returned at her normal time with everyone else. The evidence was concrete, time-stamped, documented. There was no ambiguity. I took the information to my manager, Sandra, who brought in HR that same afternoon. I showed them the letters. I showed them the badge records. I explained the escalation, the personal details, the phone call. They were professional and took it seriously. An HR representative named James told me they would handle it and that I should document any further contact. 2 days passed with no letter. Then, on Monday morning, there was an envelope on my desk again. Same cream stationery, same blue ink. But this one was different. I know you found the badge records. I know you talked to Sandra and James. I'm not angry. I understand why you did it. But I need you to understand something too. I'm not doing this to scare you. I've been here for 11 years. 11 years of walking through this building, doing my work, going home. And in all that time, no one has ever once looked at me the way you look at the world. You see things. You pay attention. You're real in a way that most people here aren't. I couldn't not write to you. That's not a choice. That's a recognition. My hands were shaking when I finished reading it. Not because of the content, though the content was disturbing enough. Because of the logistics. HR had spoken to Helen the previous Friday. I confirmed this with James. They had called her into a meeting, presented the evidence, and issued a formal warning. She had been told explicitly not to contact me in any way. And less than 48 hours later, here was another letter on my desk. But it was what I found at the bottom of the page that made me go cold in a way I hadn't experienced before. Below the main text, in smaller handwriting, was a paragraph that referenced a conversation I'd had on the phone in my apartment the night before. Sunday night. I'd called my friend Marcus in Pittsburgh and told him about the situation. I'd described the letters, the badge records, the HR meeting. I'd told him I felt guilty, weirdly, like I'd gotten someone in trouble who was just lonely. I'd said the words, "I almost feel bad for her." The letter quoted that line back to me. "You almost feel bad for me? Don't. I don't want your pity. I want you to understand." I was not at work when I said those words. I was sitting on my couch in my apartment on the 3rd floor of a building 6 miles from the office. I had said them into my phone to a friend in another state at approximately 9:30 on a Sunday night. I drove to the police station during my lunch break. I filed a report. The officer I spoke to was a detective named Ruiz who handled stalking cases. I gave her everything. The letters, the badge records, the timeline, the fact that the most recent letter contained information that could only have been obtained by monitoring my personal phone calls outside of work. She was calm and thorough and told me she would look into it. That afternoon, HR suspended Helen pending investigation. I watched from across the floor as she was escorted to collect her personal belongings. She carried a small box, the ceramic animals visible at the top. As she passed my cubicle, she didn't look at me. She looked straight ahead, her expression completely neutral, and walked to the elevator. The doors closed. She was gone. I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt something I can only describe as a wrongness, a sense that something had been resolved on the surface while remaining completely unresolved underneath. It was like putting a bandage on a wound without cleaning it first. That night in my apartment, I checked my phone. I don't know what I expected to find. I wasn't tech savvy enough to identify spyware, but I searched my apps for anything I didn't recognize. Nothing stood out. I changed my passwords anyway. I checked my windows, my door locks, the small balcony. Everything was secure. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape on my side of the building. The balcony overlooks a parking lot with no adjacent structures tall enough to see in. I did not sleep well. Around 2 a.m, I got up to get water, and as I stood in my kitchen, I looked at the window above the sink. The blinds were open. I always left them open because the window faced the back of another apartment building, and no one could see in. But standing there in the dark, I felt observed. Not in a vague, paranoid way, in a specific way. The way you feel when someone is looking at you from a particular direction. I closed the blinds. I went back to bed. I told myself it was anxiety. Detective Ruiz called me 2 days later. She told me that they had interviewed Helen Marsh at her home. Helen had been cooperative and calm. She admitted to writing the letters. She admitted to arriving early to place them. She said she had developed strong feelings, and that she understood she had crossed a line. When asked about the phone call reference, the burned garlic, she said she had simply overheard it while working late. When asked about the reference to my Sunday night conversation in my apartment, she denied writing it. Ruiz told me Helen claimed the last letter she wrote was the one before the Monday letter. She said someone else must have written the Monday one. I told Ruiz that was impossible. The handwriting was identical. The stationery was identical. The ink was identical. Ruiz agreed that it appeared to be the same author, but said Helen had been firm in her denial, and that without more evidence, they couldn't charge her with anything beyond what the company had already addressed with the suspension. She recommended I get a restraining order, which I did. She also recommended I have my phone examined for surveillance software. I took my phone to a tech shop that specialized in digital forensics. They found nothing. No spyware, no keyloggers, no unusual apps, no evidence of remote access. My phone was clean. So I was left with a question that I couldn't answer then, and that I've only partially answered since. How did someone quote words I said in my own apartment, on my own phone, in a letter left on my desk the next morning? I want to explain what the following weeks were like, because I think the fear I experienced before was theoretical compared to what came after. When someone is watching you at work, that's a violation with clear boundaries. You can involve security, HR, law enforcement. The space is defined. The threat is located. But when someone demonstrates knowledge of your private life inside your own home, every boundary dissolves. There is no safe space. There is no moment when you are not potentially observed. And that knowledge does something to your nervous system that I don't think fully reverses. I became meticulous. I swept my apartment twice, looking for devices, cameras, microphones. I checked light fixtures, smoke detectors, power outlets, the vents. I found nothing. I had my landlord change my locks. I started varying my routine, taking different routes to work, shopping at different stores. I kept my blinds closed at all times. My apartment, which had been sparse but comfortable, began to feel like a bunker. 3 weeks after Helen's suspension, she was formally terminated. I received notification from HR. The restraining order was in place. There had been no further letters. By all measurable standards, the situation was resolved. Then I found the notebook. It was a Thursday evening, about 6 weeks after the last letter. I was reorganizing my apartment, something I did when I felt anxious because the sense of control was calming. I was moving books off a shelf in my bedroom to dust behind them, and wedged between the back of the shelf and the wall was a small notebook. Black cover, about the size of a paperback, the kind you'd find in any office supply store. It was not mine. I had never seen it before. I opened it and the room went sideways. It was filled with the same handwriting, the same blue ink, the same neat right slanting script. But these weren't love letters. They were observations. Dated entries going back to January, 2 months before the first letter appeared on my desk. Descriptions of my apartment, my routines at home, what I cooked, what I watched, what I read before bed, descriptions of how I looked when I was sleeping. There were over 40 entries. Some were only a sentence or two. Others filled an entire page. The tone was the same as the letters, attentive and admiring, but the content was different. The letters at work had been about how I moved through a shared space. The notebook was about how I existed in the space I thought was mine alone. One entry, dated February 12th, said, "You talk in your sleep sometimes. Last night you said that's not right twice, and then turned onto your side. I stayed until your breathing evened out. Another, from March 3rd, a full 3 weeks before the first letter appeared at work. I brought a blanket from home because the floor by the closet is cold. You never open the closet at night, so it's safe. The door has slats. I can see the bed through them. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I stood there holding the notebook, and I looked at my closet door, which was 6 feet away from where I was standing, and I felt every hair on my body rise at once. The closet had slatted doors, angled wooden slats that you could see through if you were inside and the room was lit. From outside, looking in, the closet appeared dark. From inside, looking out, you would have a clear line of sight to the entire bedroom. I called Detective Ruiz from my car. I did not stay in the apartment. She met me there within an hour with 2 officers. They searched the closet. They found a folded blanket that was not mine, a water bottle, and a small plastic bag containing granola bars. The blanket was dark gray fleece. It had been arranged neatly in the back corner of the closet, behind my hanging clothes, in a space I never looked at because I accessed my closet from the front and never reached that deep. Someone had been living in my closet, not occasionally visiting, living, spending hours there, sleeping there, watching me through the slats while I slept, for months. The forensic team found no fingerprints that matched Helen Marsh. They found no fingerprints at all, in fact, which Ruiz said was itself significant because it suggested the person had been careful enough to wipe down everything they touched. They checked my apartment's entry points and found that the lock on the small utility window in my bathroom, which I never opened because it was painted shut, had been carefully pried at some point and could be opened from outside. The window was small, maybe 18 inches wide, but a slim person could fit through it. It accessed a narrow service ledge that ran along the back of the building, connecting to a maintenance ladder at the far end. Helen Marsh was 5'2" and slightly built. Ruiz brought her in for questioning. Helen denied everything. She had an explanation for her whereabouts on the nights in question, though her alibis were just her own testimony since she lived alone. She submitted to a handwriting analysis. The results were inconclusive, which the analyst said was unusual because the handwriting in the letters and the notebook appeared identical to the naked eye, but showed subtle differences under forensic examination that could indicate either a very consistent writer with minor variations, or 2 different people with remarkably similar handwriting. The case went to the district attorney, who declined to prosecute due to insufficient physical evidence tying Helen specifically to the apartment entries. The restraining order remained in place. I was advised to relocate. I moved out the next day. I moved to a different neighborhood, a different building, a unit on the 10th floor of a secured high-rise with a doorman and a single entry point and no utility windows and no closets with slatted doors. I installed cameras inside my apartment, 2 in the bedroom, 1 in the living room, 1 in the hallway. I checked them every night before bed and every morning when I woke up. For 3 months, nothing happened. The footage showed empty rooms. My new locks were untouched. No letters appeared anywhere. I began slowly to feel something that approached safety. Not safety itself, but its outline, its possibility. Then, on a Saturday morning in October, I was unpacking a box of books I'd never gotten around to shelving in the new place. At the bottom of the box, underneath the last row of paperbacks, was a sheet of cream-colored stationery. Heavy stock, linen texture, folded once. I recognized it before I unfolded it. The blue ink, the neat, right-slanting handwriting. I like your new apartment. The light is better here. I stared at it for a long time. Then I checked the cameras. I reviewed every second of footage from every camera for the previous 72 hours. I watched myself carrying that box in from the moving truck 3 months earlier. I watched myself set it down in the corner of the living room, where it had sat unopened until that morning. The box had been sealed with packing tape. I had sealed it myself, in my old apartment, before I knew about the notebook, before I knew about any of it, which meant the letter had been placed in the box while I was packing. In my old apartment, during the period when someone was watching me from inside my closet. It had been sitting there for 3 months, waiting for me to find it. And the person who wrote it had known even then that I would eventually move, had known that I would eventually open that box in a new place, had written a letter designed to arrive in a future they had already predicted. That realization is what finally broke something in me. Not the fear, though the fear was by then a permanent resident in my nervous system. What broke was my sense that the situation had a shape I could understand. Every time I thought I'd found the edge of it, it turned out to extend further back in time and further into my private life than I had imagined. I wasn't discovering new violations. I was discovering that violations I thought were recent had actually been happening much longer than I knew. I want to tell you where things stand now because I think it matters to say this clearly. I moved again. I left Columbus entirely. I work remotely now for a different company. I live in a small town where I know my neighbors and they know me. I have a dog, a big one, who sleeps at the foot of my bed and barks at everything. I have a security system that would be excessive for a home twice the size of mine. I have a therapist I see weekly. I am doing the work of rebuilding a sense of safety, and some days it holds, and some days it doesn't. Helen Marsh still lives in Columbus, as far as I know. The restraining order expired, and I did not renew it because I no longer live in the same state. Detective Ruiz told me before I left that she personally believed Helen was responsible for everything. The letters, the notebook, the closet, all of it, but that the case had insufficient evidence to bring charges. She said she was sorry. I believe she meant it. I check my closets every night. All of them. I open every door in my home before I go to bed, and I look inside, and I close them, and then I check the cameras. It takes about 15 minutes. My therapist says this is a reasonable accommodation for now, and that we'll work on reducing it when I'm ready. I'm not ready yet. What I carry from this experience is not a warning. I'm not telling you to watch out for love letters or to be suspicious of quiet co-workers. What I carry is something more fundamental than that. A knowledge that sat in my closet and watched me sleep, that folded itself neatly into the spaces I never thought to look, and that understood me with a patience and attentiveness that I have never experienced from anyone who actually loved me. That's the part that I haven't been able to put down. Not the fear of being watched. The fact that being truly seen, completely and obsessively and without my knowledge, felt for a brief period like the thing I'd been missing. The letters made me feel known, and the person who wrote them was 10 feet away from me in the dark, breathing quietly, waiting for me to fall asleep. I don't check the closets because I think she's there. I check them because for months she was, and I never knew. And I have to live now in a world where not knowing is no longer an innocent state. It's just the space between finding out. Remember, some places don't want you to leave. Thanks for watching the video.